All right, guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this, a Daniels Defense DDM4A1 RIS 3 chambered in 5.56. Now, when we're talking about this, we're going to talk about a little bit of background, not history, because this is not a terribly historic rifle as of yet. Daniels Defense originally started out as a fireplace cover and garage door manufacturer. In the early 2000s, Marty Daniels started taking more and more interest in shooting and the AR-15 platform. Now, this is interesting because this is during the assault weapons ban. So there's not a lot of interest in the AR-15 platform, especially when it comes to aftermarket accessories and stuff like that. The only people really buying them during the assault weapons ban, at least in a practical use type situation, are law enforcement, government agencies, and the military. However, Marty Daniels would start tinkering around with some stuff in 2002, and in 2005 his RIS 2 rail would actually get adopted by SOCOM for their SOP-MOD program. Now in 2009, Daniels Defense would start moving over to making rifles with the introduction of the DDM4, and I find this really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, I was like 19 years old in 2009 and had no idea this rifle had just come on the scene, which is interesting to think about that today because Daniels Defense is kind of a firearms household name, but its production of rifles is still relatively recent, at least in comparison to others like Colt. And I think there's a couple things that play into this for me. One, I was living in New York at the time, which pretty much meant that AR-15s were not accessible to me to begin with. Two, I spent part of 2009 not even in the country. And three, at the time, I was more interested in sporting arms and military surplus guns. I'm 19 years old. The AR-15 doesn't hold a lot of appeal to me. I'm more interested in historical type things, and I hunted and stuff like that at the time. So that was where more of my focus went. And it's not like I could get into handguns either because I was below the age of 21. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about each entry in the Daniels Defense line. At this point, we've gotten to how Daniels Defense got into pieces and parts, and now we've gotten into how they got into rifles. Let's go ahead and fast forward to 2022, when Daniels Defense at SHOT Show unveiled their RIS 3 rail, which would initially go onto the M4A1 and has now also found its way onto the DDM4 and the Mark 18. Now, it's not just the rail that plays a portion in this. There's a lot more features that go into the RIS 3 than just this rail, and we'll talk about those more once we get into features. Now, I feel like the RIS 3 hit the market with not a lot of fanfare, and to some extent, we are talking about a lot of oversaturation in the AR-15 market, which goes through it goes through bursts. There's a time where a weapons ban or something like that is coming down, and everyone's jumping through their own behinds in order to be able to get a hold of rifles and stuff like that. And then there's times of relative calm where everyone's kind of bored with the AR-15 and want to look at other options. Myself and a couple of my friends, on the other hand, took notice of that RIS 3, and I actually kind of wound up having to race a coworker to get this. He had just gotten a bonus. He and I were eyeing the same rifle at a gun shop, and I managed to move on it before he made up his mind. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers the background of this particular rifle, how it is that we got to where we are today. Why don't we go ahead and start talking about the features of this particular rifle. Starting off right off the bat, we have an A2 flash hider, which we know it's an A2 because the bottom is closed off, which does give this a little bit of a compensating type effect, but this is not a compensator. This is not a muzzle brake. Technically, it's technically a flash hider. But, it does redirect gases, therefore meeting the definition of a muzzle brake. Now, we'll note that this looks a little longer, and that is because this is a 14.5-inch cold hammer forged 1-in-7 twist chrome lined barrel, and under the National Firearms Act of 1934, a rifle cannot have a shorter than 16-inch barrel. So this muzzle device has been permanently attached to this barrel. What constitutes permanence in this case? That is pinned in welding. So now this is considered to be one continuous barrel because I cannot readily swap out this muzzle device. And that is something to keep in mind, guys, if you're looking at 14.5 pinned and weld builds. It is a pain to swap these out. A friend of mine and I decided that we wanted to swap out the muzzle device on a 14.5 Pinden weld, and we completely wrecked that barrel trying to get it off of there, which is a story for another time. It was definitely a silly time. So either take it to a gunsmith or don't mess, or just be happy with whatever it is that you have attached to here. I've decided to just be happy with it. The barrel is a government profile barrel, which 6 of one, half a dozen of another. This was kind of built with government contracts in mind, so you can understand why they might do that. This is a mid-length gas system, which I find very interesting because I like lighter recoiling gas systems in AR-15s. The carbine length gas system is not bad. It does what it's supposed to do, which is be overgassed in order to be able to overcome, any type of debris or stuff like that that might be choking up the rifle. That's the whole idea of it. But a mid-length is supposed to be getting us closer to a softer recoiling, smoother cycling rifle that makes it easier to hold on target and really drive into whatever it is that you're going after with your rifle. We'll talk about that more once we get into the shooting aspect here. Now, our rail. Our rail is the first portion about this that we have to discuss when we're talking about the RIS 3. This is a lightweight M-LOK rail with Picatinny sections across the top. You can see they're numbered, which, if that's important to you, there you go. Never really found it to be that important. We have 6 positions for your M-LOK rails. Now, when it comes to Picatinny versus M-LOK versus key mod, where do I stand on that? I've never really been that concerned about it, if I'm being completely honest. All three supply decent attachment points. There's been some discussion that perhaps key mod is not as strong of an attachment point as M-LOK, which is why M-LOK has kind of taken lead in the industry. However, Picatinny rails, if you're looking for strong attachment points, they definitely do that, but they're also very thick, very heavy type rails, whereas M-LOK and key mod can be very lightweight. Right now, M-LOK has definitely surged ahead of key mod, and it's way easier to find M-LOK accessible accessories than it is to find key mod accessories. But I own all three rails and don't really get too worried about it one way or another. Now, something else to keep in mind with this rail is that you can remove this bottom section in order to be able to mount an M203 grenade launcher that will not necessarily impact your barrel harmonics. I don't think this is the selling point that a lot of people make it out to be. It is something that's always mentioned whenever it is that we talk about like the RIS 2 or now the RIS 3 rails. First off, the vast majority of people buying this rifle are not going to be mounting grenade launchers on here. That's something that's really only applicable for the most part to law enforcement and military or government organizations. In addition to that, if you're in a position where you're mounting a grenade launcher on your weapon system, you're probably more worried about launching grenades than any minor impact that has on the accuracy of your rifle. It's, a grenadier needs to do grenadier things. He's not expected to be a sniper. No different than a rifleman's not necessarily expected to be a sniper. So just kind of like a little thing to kind of bring that overall conversation into scope. Like industry talking points are all well and good, but they don't apply in all contexts. And this is a contextually based channel. So we can see here, I have a Streamlight ProTac Rail Mount 2 with the M-LOK attachment that came with the light. As you can also see, I'm running the tail caps. Long-term viewers of the channel know that I prefer running tail caps whenever it is that I can get away with it. It cuts down on the possibility of negligent discharges of light whenever it is that you're using a pressure pad, which, given certain situations, a negligent discharge of light can be just as disastrous as gunshot. So keep that in mind whenever it is that you're evaluating these types of things. Now, something else we get with the RIS 3 rail is a 6-bolt lockup to our barrel nut. This is huge for me. Already on the RIS 2, you had a 4-bolt lockup, which was probably bomb-proof to begin with. This is even stronger. Long-term viewers of the channel who saw my video on minimum requirements for AR-15s for me, which, if you're interested in that, I'll go ahead and roll the link in the description. You'll know that I require that my handguards not move. This type of setup is going nowhere. You could set up a laser aiming module on this handguard and expect it to retain 0, no problem, for sure. That's not the case on all handguards. So I need some type of anti-rotation capability whenever it is that I'm looking at a handguard, even if I'm not necessarily expecting to mount a light on it. I don't want to get in a position where my handguard can't for whatever reason. Like that to me is shoddy craftsmanship at that point. Okay, I think that pretty much covers, well, oh, also we have QD mounts set into this rail. So if that's something that's important to you, you had that available to you. Let's go ahead and talk about this optic. Originally, I was going to run, I went through a couple of different options for optics that I was going to put on here. I thought about doing an EOTech and magnifier combination. I then thought about just doing a red dot. And when I was planning those types of things, I had Ruger folding backup iron sights on this gun. When I decided to go with this Sig Tango MSR 1:6x24, I took those sights off of here and I moved those onto my Splendid gerbil, which if you're interested in that, I'll throw a link in the description to that video. With this Sig Tango coming with its own optics mount that is not QD, as you can see there, not QD, the iron sights served no purpose because I had no way to quickly remove this optic in order to be able to get on them if something happened to the optic. So I went away from that. Now let's talk about this MSR real quick. So it's a 1:6. It is an illuminated reticle, and it uses the ACSS style horseshoe reticle type setup. I'll roll in a picture of the reticle. It also has sub-10s for distance as well as wind. This is a second focal plane reticle. A lot of people get really bent out of shape over second focal plane and like to talk about how first focal plane is the best. You should only ever use first focal plane. However, I disagree with that. And if you want more information on that, I'll go ahead and roll a link in the description to a video about it. All right, we'll talk about this optic more once we get into shooting. Now, again, when we go back to my minimum requirements for AR-15s or AR-15 setup, I need some sort of backup sighting system. So for that, I wound up taking this Vortex Crossfire red dot, as you can see right there, off of my Maverick 88 truck gun build, which if you're interested in that, I'll roll a link in the description. I wound up mounting PRI iron sights on that particular gun, which is a conversation for another time. I'm running it in this 45-degree offset mount, and I'm a big fan of the 45-degree offset mount in conjunction with magnified optics. This is great for, of course, if the optic goes down, I still have a red dot to be able to work off of. And in addition to that, should I have this dialed up and I wind up having to deal with a closer range threat or shooting from an unnatural position that maybe this optics is not working with, I have the red dot to be able to work off of. Now, some people prefer offset iron sights, and to that I say to each their own, but I'm not a big fan of the concept. And that primarily comes back to I'm already shooting from a suboptimal position by having the rifle canted. Like, we can all agree that we were all taught to shoot with the rifle upright like this. So when I cant it, I'm already kind of changing a lot of different ballistic aspects and stuff like that depending on the distance that I'm engaging at. Especially if I'm shooting from unorthodox positions or something along those lines and needing to use my red dot to do so, or needing to use my backup sight to do so because my optic doesn't permit me, I would rather not have to line up two different focal points in order to be able to take that shot. I would much rather work off of a red dot, which is already really, like, red dots in general are very helpful for shooting from unnatural positions to begin with. So something to keep in mind there. You can do it with irons, it's just more difficult. All right, now this also has Daniels Defense's grip and rip charging handle. An important thing to remember for Daniels Defense is that their claim to fame is that they build all their parts in-house. And that's especially important when you talk about the barrel, because they're one of the few companies that have cold hammer forge barrel machines, which is pretty cool. Now, when it comes to the grip and rip charging handle, I don't get too bent out of shape over oversized ambidextrous charging handles. I've never really found it to be that helpful. However, whenever I have a magnified optic and stuff like that, if the bell is going over top of the charging handle, I do consider that to be helpful in that case to be able to get a hold of that charging handle. However, when you're talking about like using red dots or iron sights or anything along those lines, I don't think oversized charging handles are that great because I don't spend that much time interacting with them. The only time I'm getting on the charging handle is if I'm clearing a malfunction, if I'm showing clear, or like clearing out the rifle of all ammunition, or if I am like putting the first round of the chamber. You know, I was out on patrol or something like that, didn't have a round of the chamber, and now I need one in there for whatever reason. Or if I took it on a trip or something like that and had an empty chamber. Like, that's the only time this is going to get used. That's not a part of my reload setup. It's not something that I'm interacting often enough that I feel like it needs to be more accessible. At least at this point. Who knows? Maybe in future training, I might discover that that's not the case, and I actually start preferencing these. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and get into the nitty gritty on the upper receiver. If you've seen my previous AR-15 videos, you know what I have to say about this upper receiver. Go ahead, check the description. I have chapters laid out there. Go ahead and jump to content that you want to consume. For the rest of you, this does have a forward assist, which is a minimum requirement for me, which irritates a lot of people. For some reason, the forward assist is a hot button, get it, topic in the Second Amendment community. A lot of people like to cite that Eugene Stoner said that we didn't need a forward assist, that the forward assist is only going to cause more harm than good. When have you ever used a forward assist? I've actually used a forward assist quite frequently, especially whenever it is that I'm conducting a press check or something like that at a competition or a course or something along those lines. Sometimes there's just not enough oomph on the spring to be able to get that bolt all the way into battery, especially if you're in a dusty environment or the rifle's starting to get a little dry, a little gunked up. So it's just real easy to go ahead, hit that forward assist, and now when you come up from your low ready or whatever, you have rounds on hand instead of getting a click no bang, which you always want to try to do whatever you can to diminish the possibility of a click no bang. The important thing to remember about a forward assist is it's just like any other tool. It is not a reset button. It does not fix all of your problems. Some things cannot be fixed with a forward assist, and you're actually going to have to conduct some sort of immediate or remedial action in order to be able to get the rifle back into the fight. So I consider this mostly an administrative function here. Brass deflector. Huge fan of brass deflectors, especially if you're doing cross-shoulder shooting or something along those lines. Got a left-handed shooter around, something like that. Some people like to forego the brass deflector, cut down a little bit of weight, give it a more period correct look if you're doing like a retro build or something along those lines. That's a vibe. I get that. It's just not my vibe. So, you know, to each their own when it comes to the brass deflector. The dust cover, another minimum requirement for me. I want to seal up the system as often as I can. So especially based off of training I've received in the past, schools that I've gone to and stuff like that, where closing this was a gradable criteria, I make sure that this is closed anytime that I'm not actively shooting the rifle to guard against the possibility for the ingress of foreign material. Now, Daniels Defense makes theirs out of plastic, which I don't think is the worst thing in the world. Ultimately, you just need something to provide a barrier. It doesn't really matter what it's made out of. I will say that when it comes to metal dents, and that could wind up messing up the function of your dust cover. Whereas plastic, if you hit it hard enough, it's gonna break, which, I mean, isn't necessarily any better, but at least it's not dented. All right, now we're gonna get into our lower receiver, and this is where we get the other features that makes this rifle individual as a RIS 3. Now, one thing that doesn't is the ambidextrous safety, which is pretty common on all Daniels Defense rifles. It is a full-size, full-length safety on either side, which I'm not a big fan of. Already, in general, I'm not a big fan of ambidextrous safeties. They irritate my grip, and it gets on my nerves. Keep in mind, guys, my original training, like my earliest training on AR-15s, like the stuff that really set me on my path, was with single-sided guns. So it's very normal for me to utilize my firing hand to manipulate that safety. So utilizing this portion of my hand to turn it off, and then curling my hand back to be able to turn it back on. When it comes to ambidextrous type stuff, and this is going to be a huge portion of this conversation moving forward, so let's go ahead and get this out of the way. When it comes to ambidextrous rifles, I am dubious as to how helpful they are to right-handed shooters and most definitely left-handed shooters. There are two circumstances that I think we have to take into account when we talk about left-handed shooters. A lot of left-handed shooters, I don't want to say a lot of. If a left-handed shooter has already been training on AR-15s set up for right-handed shooters, they've already built coping mechanisms in order to be able to work around a right-handed rifle. They've already figured it out for themselves and all that kind of stuff. They've already come up with it. And I realized this when I set up a right-handed rifle for a left-handed shooter, that a lot of the features that I put on there were just not that helpful to them because they'd already figured out how to work around that stuff. If you have a brand new left-handed shooter who went ahead and bought an ambidextrous rifle, that would be very helpful to them because they're starting off working around the same accessibility that a right-handed shooter would have. In my opinion, when it comes to ambidextrous features, it's kind of like right-handed privilege. It's like, oh no, poor lefties, they don't have anything that works for them. Let's just go ahead and set the guns up for them, and not really taking into context a lot of different aspects of that. It's not the worst thing in the world. It's just something to keep in mind that these types of features are not necessarily all that helpful in all ways. Now, could I break my training habits and work around left-handed or ambidextrous safeties? Absolutely, I have before, and I do prefer a shorter offside lever so that it doesn't irritate my grip as much. All right, moving forward, we also have an ambidextrous bolt catch. Now, again, I find this to be of very specific help. For me, this is pretty helpful if I'm at a course or a competition or something like that and it's time to show clear. I can go ahead and drop that source of feed and then very easily lock that bolt to the rear so that I can show clear. However, when it comes to coming off of a reload or something like that, my natural instinct is to drop that magazine, insert my new source of feed, and then hit that ping pong paddle and get right back into the fight. It's not that helpful to be able to do that on this side. Now, if I started off training with ambidextrous rifles, yeah, it would be slightly faster for me to go ahead and get that source of feed in there, and then as I build my grip, release that bolt with my trigger finger and get right back on it and get right back to work. But as it stands now, I would have to change quite a few neural pathways to really be able to take advantage of this. And I have a lot of guns that don't have this as a feature. So is it the end all be all? No, not necessarily. It's not the worst thing in the world either. Now, our magazine release is also ambidextrous. You can see the other side of the lever there is set in the front of the trigger guard. Again, maybe for administrative functions. If I was spending a lot of time, like let's say I was set up on a corner where I didn't want to expose my body so much to be able to use my right side, so I'm working primarily off of my left, you know, I'm holding security for a stack or something like that on the corner of a building and I get into an extended gunfight. Yeah, sure. I can go ahead and drop that magazine and now I can use all these great ambidextrous features. That's a pretty niche category that most people don't fall into. So something to keep in mind with that. Our magazine well is flared to help with the insertion of magazines. Pretty good feature. It's not like the greatest thing in the world, but it's not the worst. Our trigger, also ambidextrous. Who knew? All right, let's go ahead and talk about this trigger real quick. This trigger is not the greatest in the world, and we'll talk about why that might be applicable to you here in a little bit. It's kind of a two-stage trigger, and it's very mushy. The wall is pretty defined, but there's a lot of creep beforehand, and your reset puts you out in front of it. So not the biggest, like, this trigger's nothing to write home about. I'm no trigger snob by any means, but I can understand why, when we get into conclusions here after a little bit, why this trigger might be a problem for some people. Our pistol grip is the Daniels Defense ergonomic pistol grip, ergo grip, or whatever it is that they call it. I don't get too broken up about pistol grips. The only thing I get worried about are A2 bumps because they do kind of grind on my finger and I Dremel those off because of that. I will say that this does have kind of an A2-esque bump right there, but I have a lot more space above it for my finger to where it doesn't feel like it grinds very much. So far, it's not been an issue, but something I'm kind of keeping an eye on. But like this rubberized and all that kind of stuff, not that worried about it. Like grips on handguns, like the ergonomics of a grip on a handgun, I get really concerned about. But this is really just something I'm pulling against. This is not like, you know, some people like Hogue grips and stuff like that because it's real tacky and stuff like that. I've never found that to be helpful personally. Now we have a standard 6-position buffer tube and all that kind of stuff. We have a QD point set into the rear of the receiver, which I have this set up with an HK style single point sling. I'm not the biggest fan of single point slings. I just happened to get this one for free and was like, why not? I'll just go ahead and throw it on this rifle. When you're doing like cross shoulder stuff, single points are great. If you're doing pistol transitions and all that type of stuff, single points are horrific. You're gonna rack yourself every time. But to each their own when it comes to that. That's probably something I'll upgrade in the future. Now our buttstock is Daniels Defense's setup for buttstocks. You can kind of see it has a little bit of like a D or a P type shape. This does come with a replaceable butt pad that you can make a little bit longer if you need like a little bit more length of pull. We have this same rubberization that we see on the grip on the buttstock here. Some people complain about this pulling beard hair. I don't grow facial hair beyond this scruff every once in a while. It's never really been an issue for me. We kind of have a little bit of like a SOP mod, you know, side saddle type profile to it. I will say that the release for this stock is kind of stiff, but the stock itself has a little bit of rattle. Not that bad. Again, it's not a precision rifle. I'm not that worried about it. We didn't talk about our bolt, but it is a standard mil-spec bolt. There is nothing super impressive about it, minus that it's got DD stenciled onto it, if that's important to you. But everything about that, you know, Carpenter, it's all the things that you want out of an AR-15 bolt. Mil-spec standard. We also have QD points set into the stock, by the way. This did come with a Daniels Defense 32 round magazine. I don't get too broken up about AR-15 magazines. When they stop working, I throw them away and I get new ones. Most of the time, cheap ones, because I'm just not that worried about it. So like I run a lot of GI mags and I have some mag pulls and stuff like that, but I don't get really bent out of shape over what magazines I use. All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot? All right, so first off, let's go ahead and talk about this gas system. When I first got this gun, knowing that it had a mid-length gas system, I thought for sure this was going to be very soft recoiling and enjoyable. At first, it was a little bit more punchy than I thought a mid-length gas system should be. And it's not unusual for Daniels Defense to kind of oversize their gas ports a little bit. I will say that as time has gone on, this gun has almost like broken in and it feels less punchy. It's actually very enjoyable to shoot. So I'm getting the advantages that I wanted out of a mid-length gas system. However, initially this did not like 223 ammunition. I was getting a little bit worried about that for a little bit. However, we've gotten to the point where it's now cycling reliably. And when I say cycling reliably, I mean the bolt's locking to the rear. Because keep in mind, guys, a bolt not locking fully to the rear is technically a malfunction. May not be the worst case scenario of malfunction. It's not a bolt override by any means, but it is still the gun not doing what it is that it's supposed to do. So keep that in mind whenever it is that you're evaluating this stuff. But now it's started running just fine with 223 ammunition, which is what I primarily shoot because it's cheaper. All right, this optic, how do I feel about this 1:6? When I first got it, I got to be completely honest, I was not that impressed. So the eye box is not as forgiving as I would like it to be, even on 1 power. And at first I was having a lot of issue like getting good cheek placement. And it was actually when I added this offset red dot and moved this forward a little bit, this rifle became a lot more comfortable to shoot. So I kind of ran this a little bit closer to my eye, and this is pretty much the length that I run all of my stocks, and it was really too close. Once I pushed it out a little bit, which I thought about lengthening the stock, but you know, once I added this and that required me to move the optic a little bit further forward, it became a lot easier and more comfortable to be able to mount this rifle. So that really worked out pretty good for me. All right, when it comes to moving this rifle around, this is a wonderfully balanced rifle. It really is. Like I like lightweight short setups. That's why most of my AR builds are shorties or SBRs that I put together. That's why I like the M1 carbine and stuff like that. And even on my longer guns, like my favorite longer rifles, 16, 18-inch guns, like my Mark 12 Mod Murph, which if you're interested in that, check out the link in the description. Those still have lighter weight rails on them and stuff like that to give them good balance. So they're not too front heavy or anything along those lines. This thing is a joy to do like ready ups and stuff like that with. I really, really like this rail for that reason. Okay, how has accuracy been? Well, guys, as you know, this is not a channel that really gets broken up about accuracy and stuff like that. So I've really only shot 55 grain ammunition, and I got this 3 5/16 group at 100 yards with PMC gold, 55 grain. So that's within fighting rifle type expectation. Like I have a 4 MOA expectation for fighting rifles. This rifle is meeting that expectation. Not an accuracy snob. I'm not that worried about it doing better than that. It's meeting minute of man, and that is within what I expect to be able to do with this rifle for its engagement envelope to me. All right, guys. That's shooting. What are my recommendations when it comes to this particular rifle? Would I recommend this for duty type use? Absolutely. Without question. If this is within your department's budget, if you're a law enforcement agency who's looking to get new rifles, absolutely look into these. If you're somebody who can carry your own rifle at work and stuff like that, you should absolutely be looking into this. This is a steadfast and amazing rifle. Now that the gas system's kind of worked itself out a little bit and all that kind of stuff, which, if I'd started out with 5.56 ammunition right off the bat instead of 2.23 ammunition, I wouldn't have even noticed. But, here we are. That's what we're doing. So absolutely, without question, this would be a fantastic duty type rifle. Well, what about home defense, self-defense? When it comes to self-defense, this would not be my first choice for like a truck gun or anything along those lines. Like definitely not, I'm not into open carrying rifles, and I would prefer a much more compact setup for a truck gun or something along those lines. Home defense? Absolutely. Zero reason that you cannot use this to be able to cover a doorway or something along those lines. This would not be my first choice for CQB. It's a touch long for that type of application. I have other stuff that would better fit that. But if we're talking about being able to just cover doors or cover a stairwell or something along those lines, this rifle can do it no problem. It's important to keep in mind whenever it is that you talk about using a rifle for home defense is your backdrop. So if you live in an apartment complex, maybe not the best choice. But if you live in a little more open area, this wouldn't be all that bad. You really have to be very cognizant of where it is that you are going to be able to engage and where you're not going to be able to engage. So for my purposes, for how my home defense strategy more or less would work out, I would have safe lanes of fire to where I'm effectively protecting myself and my family, and not necessarily endanger the neighbors. So that's something that you really got to look into. Don't wait for bad things to happen to then decide like, oh, man, I wonder how I can get through this without becoming a felon. So try to lean into that as best you can. What about as a competition rifle? I see no reason why you could not do that. Mid-length gas system is going to make recoil management a lot easier to be able to really drive those splits, be able to get those good groups and all that kind of stuff. You got all these great features and all that kind of stuff. This would do just like it would be a no-brainer answer for whether or not you should use this professionally. It's the same type of deal for using this as a competition rifle. One thing that I will say though, with how this is configured, I'm just under 9.5 pounds. So keep in mind that even though you do have a fairly lightweight base rifle, as you add things, you've really got to keep reevaluating your weight and feature balance. So keep that in mind. What about as a hunting rifle? Depends on the hunting, depends on your local laws. A lot of places a 223 or 5.56 round is not legal for hunting. In some places it is. For pig hunting and stuff like that, this wouldn't be bad, especially with the setup. This would be pretty applicable to pig hunting, because a lot of times in that type of stuff, you're talking about like varmint eradication, like Texas and all those types of things. Those guys are using rifles like this in order to be able to hunt pigs. If you wanted to go and take this on coyote or something along those lines, another thing you have to keep in mind is, of course, capacity limitations for hunting. Most states don't let you carry more than 10 rounds unless it's varmint, so that's something that you have to keep in mind if you're looking to get into that type of thing with this type of rifle. All right, what about as a woods gun? If you're talking about like hiking and stuff like that, I don't know if I would necessarily default to this as an option. It's not really where my brain goes. But, to each their own when it comes to that. If you're talking about bear defense or anything along those lines, this is not this is not the one that I would choose. Now, if you're talking about like throwing this across the back of the Gator to go, you know, bebop around your property, wouldn't be the worst option. You know, take some pot shots at some stumps or something along those lines, or maybe have to deal with some varmints of either the 2- or 4-legged variety. This would be able to do that. All right, so what are my recommendations? What are the things, especially like the trigger and maybe the accuracy aspects of this, that you might want to take into account? This is a over $2,000 rifle. So now when we come back to the trigger and stuff like that, we gotta reevaluate a lot of the features of this rifle now as to whether or not this constitutes a $2,000 price point, because this rifle falls into the exact same price point as this rifle, my LWRC M6 IC-A5 chambered 5.56, my Alphabet rifle, which if you're interested in the reviews on this, both the original and the update review, go ahead and check the links in the description. This rifle is a little bit more expensive, but it has a lot of the same features. It's ambidextrous. It has, you know, all these premium things going on with it, high quality barrel, all that kind of stuff, coming in at pretty comparable accuracy, and is piston driven, right? Which is probably why there's a little bit of a price disparity between the two. So what makes you want to buy this over this? Well, that's a very to each their own type of consideration. But I will say that I think in a lot of ways these rifles are very comparable, and I think we can look forward to some sort of comparison video coming in the very near future. All right. So with that being the case, what are competitive offerings that I would steer you towards? Well, of course, the LWRC M6 IC A5. Absolutely love this rifle. That would be another option you could look into. If you're wanting to stick in the AR-15 vein, you could also look at LMT's Mars series of rifles, which are also very expensive, but have a lot of these same ambidextrous features and are exceedingly high quality rifles. If you wanted to get away from the AR-15 vein, there are a lot of 5.56 chambered offerings out there that are not AR-15s that are also highly ambidextrous. I think one of the best examples of that was the Beretta ARX100, which good luck trying to find one. Or the ARX is really what it was imported as. Good luck trying to find those. It seems that Beretta has stopped importing them. I had the chance to get one some years ago for a really good price and unfortunately had to pass on it, and I've been kicking myself ever since. Regardless, there are a ton of different options you could look at. Those are just some to kind of run you in the direction of. And, you know, let me know what ARX prices are doing right now. I haven't checked those in a while. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and it's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.